Well, hello guys. This is Katie with Vintage and Vinyl, back with another great video for you. And I am so excited to be joined by Patrick, part of the Duo Dive, and our special guest of honor, Melissa from the Poison Book Project. And this is just going to be a very fascinating Duo Dive. So Melissa, welcome to you, and welcome Patrick.
Thank you.
Great to be here again.
So Melissa is with the Poison Book Project, and I want to talk a little bit about how I got started researching some of these Paris Green books. So interestingly enough, I was scrolling through Instagram one day, and I found a reel that was talking about books that are poisoned, and it was a guy that sells and deals in antique books. And I was totally fascinated because I'd never heard of this before. And I started doing some research, and I found the Poison Book Project, and I had a green book at home. And so I suddenly was wondering now if this book was one of the books that was releasing its toxic gas into the air. And I was totally fascinated, and I reached out to Melissa, and I'm so glad that we can have her on the show tonight. So Melissa, why don't you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about the Poison Book Project?
Thank you. So I'm Dr. Melissa Tedone, and I am the lab head for the Library Conservation Lab at Winterthur Museum, Garden, and Library. And then I'm also a professor in the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation. So that's a master's level graduate program training art conservators. And I teach the library and archives conservation specialty there.
That is fantastic, Melissa. Very interesting. So how did you get started working with these poison books?
So actually, it was sort of by accident. I happened to be reading a book called Bitten by Witch Fever, which was a book about arsenic-containing wallpapers in Victorian England, which was a fascinating book. It reproduces a bunch of the beautiful wallpapers. And so I sort of had arsenic wallpaper on my mind when a book came into the conservation lab that had been requested for an exhibit, and it was covered in bright green cloth. And I was examining it under the microscope, and there were some black accretions like stuck to the surface of the book. And so I was poking at them a little bit to see if I could get them to release. And I noticed that the pigment was very friable, meaning that it was very crumbly. And I could see little specks of it coming off under the microscope. And that surprised me. And it also worried me because I was thinking, oh, could this be arsenic containing emerald green? And so luckily we have a really wonderful scientific research and analysis lab at Winterthur. So I was able to just reach out to my colleague, Dr. Rosie Grayburn, who is my partner on the Poison Book Project. And I asked her, hey, is there some way we could test for emerald green pretty easily? And she said, sure, bring the book down to the science lab. And so she used XRF, which is X-ray fluorescence, which is a non-destructive technique, which means we didn't have to take a sample from the book. It is a device that basically looks like a ray gun. And she was able to just point it at the book and pull the trigger. And within a few minutes, we knew that we had a book that was covered in arsenic.
Wow.
And that really kind of kicked off the project, because as soon as we realized that, we thought, well, is this like really rare? Is this just one unusual binding? Or are we likely to find many more of these bindings? I mean, the book that we analyzed was from 1857, and it was really a mass-produced Victorian book. And so there really was a really good chance that we were going to find more of these out there. And indeed, we've found dozens of these books now.
That is totally fascinating. Now, why were some of these books covered in this Paris green or arsenic?
You know, I think that it was just a really popular color at the time. Emerald green, or Paris green, which are common names for the compound copper acetoarsenite, this pigment was being used in a lot of domestic products at the time. So Women's ball gowns were being colored with it. It was really popular for decorating hats. It was in children's toys. It was in wallpaper. It was in wall paint. I think the Victorians just really loved bright, vibrant greens. If you think about like the Industrial Revolution and what it must have been like living in cities at the time, it was probably really sooty and dirty and everything was sort of dingy and gray. So if you think about like these really bright, vivid green products, it probably made people happy. It probably made them think of the countryside, right? And that probably boosted their mood. And so I think, you know, the book cloth manufacturers were like, hey, green is popular. Let's start making green book cloth.
Now, can you talk a little bit about some of the book bindings? Because I do know that some of the earlier book bindings used even earlier books inside their book bindings to make the books that we have from the Victorian times.
Yes. So a lot of the books that were printed in the Victorian times were sort of semi-mass produced. It was a time in book history where printing technology was sort of outpacing the actual binding technology. So lots and lots of books were being printed, and book binderies had just dozens and dozens of people who were working in sort of an assembly line fashion. And so you can end up with like many books that are the same imprint that might be bound in the same cloth or that could be bound in different cloths. And then, you know, it's also possible that these books were rebound at a later date as well. But for books that were bound in the 19th century with 19th century book cloth, that's sort of the time period that we're focusing on for the Poison Book Project. And it's the time period when we're finding the most toxic elements in book cloth.
Now, when do you think that they stopped using this Paris green in the book cloth?
So far, I mean, we haven't scanned all the green books that are out there in the world, but so far, the latest dates that we've found have been in the 1860s. And really past that, books published in the 1870s and later, we're finding have a different pigment in them, chrome green, that's giving them that green color. And I think also like the fashion shifted a little bit. So from the 1840s to the 1860s, we see these really brilliant, bright, vivid emerald green books. But a little later in the 1870s, you start to see the greens turn into sort of a deeper, more forest green. And, you know, you still wouldn't want to lick those books. Like chromium is not a great element to ingest, but it's far less toxic than arsenic. It's probably not going to kill you.
Now, the
I was doing some research on the, you know, prepping for you to come on. I came across a term, and I just had to look it up because I couldn't remember. They were referring to Scheele's green.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So did that replace arsenic, or was that just like a contemporary version of it that gave a slightly different hue?
So Scheele's green is actually a pigment that predates emerald green a little bit. It was Scheele's green was in use in the late 18th century. And it's also a bright green, but it's more yellowish. And pretty quickly, people figured out that it's not light fast. It sort of fades and goes brownish really easily. And so when emerald green was invented it was probably first discovered around 1800. And by 1814, it was being produced commercially in Bavaria. And I think it sort of superseded Scheele's green in popularity because it was light fast. So people didn't have to worry about that fading. You know, you didn't want to invest in a beautiful ball gown and then have it fade and look all brownish after just a few wears.
No, that wouldn't be good. Now, Tim from Teofane, he's in Canada. He's got a great question. He's asking if there are any anecdotal accounts of people getting sick from a poison book. And I do know there's accounts of people getting sick from the wallpapers in their very homes.
That is a great question. And yes, there are lots of accounts of people getting sick from wallpapers. I've only found one so far of someone getting sick from a book, and that was in Troy, New York in the mid 1800s. And it was an emerald green, like glazed paper covering the book. And a little boy was using that book as a watercolor palette. So he was like licking his brush and dipping it in the paints and then swirling it on the book cover. So he was actually ingesting small amounts of arsenic from the book cover. And he got violently, violently ill. And it took the doctors several days to figure out what was wrong with him. But they did actually figure out that he had been poisoned by this book cover. And he thankfully did recover after several excruciating days of illness. But there were many accounts in the 19th century newspapers about people dying from exposure to wallpaper and wall paint that contained arsenic, particularly in England, where the climate was very damp. And that dampness allows a certain type of mold to grow on the wallpaper. And that mold actually digests the pigment and releases arsine gas into the air. And arsine gas is the absolute most toxic form of arsenic. It doesn't take very much inhalation to make you quite ill. The analogy I like to use to try to help people visualize it is, so at 5 parts per million in the air, arsine gas can start to make you visibly sick. And that's the equivalent of a half an inch in a 16-mile span. So it's really not very much toxic gas at all to start to make you feel really ill.
I did read accounts of people in the Victorian times that were getting ill in their houses due to the wallpaper, and then they would leave and go to the beach or an open air area, and they would get better, and then they'd come back to their houses and they would get really, really ill again. And the doctors couldn't seem to figure it out. I am curious if you know anything about Dr. Robert Mackenzie's book from 1874, Shadows of the Walls of Death. He wrote that book, and it contains, I think, over 100 samples of Victorian era wallpaper.
Yeah, it does. It's a really interesting book. I have never seen it in person, but the National Institute of Health on their library's website, they actually have a digitized version of the book that you can flip through, which is really fascinating. And Dr. Kedzie actually, he was sort of a canary in the coal mine. You know, he was one of the early people who were really warning about the dangers of emerald green and the fact that people were getting sick. So it's a really unique and an important book. He collected all of these samples of wallpaper to put in the book, and there are only a few copies of this book that I know of. I know NIH has one, and I think the University of Michigan or Michigan State
is the University of Michigan.
University of Michigan, yeah. They have another copy of it.
Your colleague Jan Jennings was quoted in an article about the book. Or I'm assuming she's your colleague. So she's from Winterthur, but this was a few years ago, and said that it's the University of Michigan considers it its most dangerous book.
Yeah, it is.
Which I guess it would be.
And
one of the questions that I have, I'm sorry, Katie, one of the questions that I have, and it's this is one of those things that most people do not realize. Trusty has a chemistry degree. So I'm trying to put together, you were talking about the friability of the surface of the book, but then you were also saying that I guess I'm trying to figure out is how is the arsenic actually, did it impregnate the cloth? Did it sit on, was it like a paint or was it a dye? How was it separating from, I found the mold comment fascinating too, but how is it becoming separated from the surface of the books?
That's a great question. And it sort of speaks to the way that book cloth was manufactured. So it's important to keep in mind that at this time period, book cloth was actually a brand new product. It was only invented in the 1820s, and it really only went into wide commercial production in the 1830s. So, it took a while for book cloth manufacturers to figure out how to make a successful, durable, light fast book cloth that consumers would accept. Because in the beginning, consumers were like, no, books are supposed to be bound in leather. I'm not going to buy these cloth covered books. And so the way that the book cloth is manufactured is that the color is mixed with sort of a slurry of starch, and then that is scraped onto the surface of the book cloth. So it's not the fibers of the cloth that are dyed directly. It's actually this coating that has the colorant in it. And most book cloth coatings from that time period are pretty well adhered to the book. I mean, I think, it's taken us a while to understand the way the book cloths were made, because it really seemed like the fibers had been colored. And with the emerald green, that sort of starchy coating it pops up and blows apart really easily. And one of the things that our project is looking at is trying to understand if the arsenic is degrading the binder that was holding that colored slurry onto the cloth. We have a colleague who studies orpiment, which is another arsenic-based pigment. It's a yellow pigment. She's a paintings conservator, and she has been studying the way that arsenic pigment breaks down the binder in paintings, like oil paintings. And so we're wondering if there's a correlation there with the book cloth.
Now, is it a case like asbestos that it's relatively safe if it has not started to degrade off of the surface, or it's going to kill you regardless? Okay. And I think that goes back to, I don't know, Katie, if you can show Catherine's question.
Yes, I was just about to ask that.
Maybe if you could show this, I know you do have a sample of a book, and maybe we can get an idea. I don't think you can see the slurry process, but maybe we get an idea what it looks like.
So I'm trying to angle this so the glare isn't too bad. I'm not going to take it out of this plastic bag because I don't want to touch it.
You're not insured.
Yep. So you can see it is a pretty vivid green. Many of these books are often decorated with gold stamping and blind stamping. They often have gilt edges as well. I think that gold and green combination is just really dramatic. And so, it was very appealing to the public at that time.
So you have this book in a bag, and we're probably all wondering that must mean these books are very dangerous. So how dangerous really are these?
So, I mentioned that we used XRF to detect the presence of the arsenic. That's a kind of test that is very much just yes or no. Like, yes, arsenic is there, or no, it's not. And it couldn't tell us how much arsenic was there. So we did actually do a kind of testing that required us to take a destructive sample of book cloth. And we sent it to our colleagues at the University of Delaware, and we actually sent it to the soil testing lab. So if you're a gardener and you've ever had your soil tested to, find out the levels of phosphorus and lead and things like that, it's a lab like that. And they were able to tell us how much arsenic was present in the book cloth. And so we found the book that we were testing was about this size, like close to an octavo sized book. And we found that in that size book, there was enough arsenic to kill 5 average sized adults if they ate it. Okay, so they would have to ingest it. But it just gives you an idea of how much arsenic is likely present in so many of these books. And it does offset on your hands. Even if you can't see the pigment offsetting, detectable amounts of arsenic do offset onto your hands. We tested for that as well. And so, you could be touching your face and breathing in the arsenic, or, if you're smoking a cigarette or biting your nails after handling one of these books, you could be ingesting enough arsenic that it could be having a negative impact on you, even if it's not going to kill you.
Now, Tim is asking, would this type of poisoning manifest as a sudden onset illness or long-term and chronic symptoms?
That's a great question. And, I'm not a medical doctor. We've been trying to talk to many different types of people who are sort of connected to health and safety. We've talked to toxicologists, industrial hygienists, epidemiologists, trying to understand, like, how does this arsenic poisoning manifest? And the really kind of scary thing about arsenic is that it seems to be a little bit unpredictable, what different people's level of sensitivity is. It kind of has to do with your personal genetics. So some people are very, very sensitive to a small amount of arsenic, and some people just kind of naturally have a slightly higher tolerance to it. And so small chronic exposure might manifest as gastrointestinal issues or headaches. If you're touching it a lot and you have sensitive skin, you might get a rash or sores on the skin. And then the more acute poisoning would be, severe headaches, severe gastrointestinal distress, and then your organs would start shutting down.
And really, as Proud American is asking, is there a cure for this?
Not that I know of, but again, I'm not a medical expert. So I think in the case of these books, the best cure is just not to get exposed to the arsenic in the first place.
And so really, as far as collectors go, and a lot of people, I just saw Jamie's comment about eyeballing all of her green books. What do people do? I mean, if they think they have a green book, like I thought that my book here might be poisonous, and we were talking before the show, and Melissa thinks that this book might be a different type of poison that's not as dangerous as arsenic, but I do still need to be careful with it. So, I mean, how do people handle these and store them, especially with a lot of antique and vintage collectors in our community?
Yeah, well, you've done exactly the right thing by putting the suspicious book in a bag, a zip top bag, to contain anything that might shed off of it. We have 10 of these books at Winterthur Library, and nobody handles them without wearing nitrile gloves. You can buy nitrile gloves at any hardware store, and that will provide enough of a barrier that you won't be able to. Well, this is something else I should mention. So when the arsenic is stable, the emerald green is a stable pigment, then the chances are you won't absorb any of it through your skin. It's mostly a danger if you accidentally ingest or inhale, pigment dust. But we do have some colleagues at Northwestern who have been looking into the degradation mechanisms, and they've found that as emerald green book cloth deteriorates, it shifts into a form of arsenic that is actually easier to absorb through the skin. So definitely you want to wear gloves. You want to wash your hands. Even if you wore gloves to handle the book, wash your hands carefully afterwards, and keep the books sealed in a zip top bag to contain any of that pigment and to prevent anyone from accidentally picking the book up, not realizing what it is. I also, I made a little label for my book that, has the catchy skull and crossbones on it, and then a little written warning just explaining about the book cloth, just in case someone was at my house and saw this book and picked it up wondering what it was, they would know not to open the bag and take the book out.
So the dangers with these books are not just handling it, but also the dust from the cloth that can get into the air.
Yeah, I mean, it's so friable. It does seem like that pigment dust can offset onto other objects. So we recommend that if people, really do want to read a book that's emerald green, that they put it on a hard surface like a table, not holding it on an upholstered surface like an armchair where that dust can get down into the upholstery. You would want to use it on a hard surface and then wipe down that surface with a damp cloth afterwards, just to be sure you're getting up any of that pigment dust. I also want to mention, like, I know that a lot of folks in the vintage community like to upcycle things, which I'm a sustainability minded person and I really love the whole upcycling trend. But when it comes to 19th century books, I just really want to caution people against the idea of making them into handbags or making them into covers for your tablets or e-readers, that sort of thing. We're finding more and more that 19th century cloth covered books are full of all sorts of toxic elements, not just arsenic, but chromium, lead, mercury. So you do want to kind of limit how much you handle them, and definitely wash your hands immediately after handling any of these books, just to be safe.
This is very good because a lot of people in our community love to junk journal. So they love to take old things apart and make a new journal and glue things together. And I think this is a really nice warning as well for some of those older books. Probably not a good idea to use those for your junk journaling projects. Now, we had mentioned storing, and I have a zip top bag here, but you were telling me before the show that this zip top bag will work for now, but it's not good in the long run. So what bags do you recommend for storing some of these books that we might feel are suspicious?
That's a great question. So first off, if all you had in your home was a food quality zip top bag, get your suspicious book into that bag. That is fine. The bag is going to protect you. But for the long term, for the safety of the book, you should look into a zip top bag that's made of polyethylene. We use a 4 mil polyethylene at Winterthur. A 3 mil would also be okay, but I wouldn't go any thinner than that because I might worry about the seams of the bag sort of breaking open over time. But polyethylene is a very stable, inert plastic that ages well. And it's a different type of plastic than the plastic that food storage bags are made out of. Over time, those food storage bags will leach out plasticizers that can, get on the books and complicate what's going on with their surface chemistry.
That's not good at all. Now, Cheryl is asking about any color. So I wanted to mention you actually have a bookmark that people can send in for. And can you talk a little bit about this bookmark and the colors in which we need to be looking out for some of these books?
Absolutely. And could I ask you to flip it, Katie, and show the other side of the bookmark too? So this side of the bookmark has color swatches from the boards of the book, the front and back covers. And then the other side of the bookmark has color swatches from the spine piece. And with emerald green books, we see different colors in the spine and on the boards because while emerald green is a very light, fast pigment, it is sensitive to sulfurous air pollution. So sulfur in the air can cause the emerald green to oxidize, and that's what makes it turn that sort of darker brown. So don't be surprised if you see an emerald green book, if it's the cloth might look very brown on the spine, but still be very bright green on the boards. And we made this bookmark because we were finding that the emerald green books that we detected through analysis were actually a very consistent bright color green. So we thought that actually a bookmark would be a great tool. It's not perfect, right? Because everyone sees color subjectively, but we just thought that it would help people kind of take a first pass through their collections, and it would give them an idea of whether they should actually be worried or not. So, if you have darker forest greens or like very pale minty greens in your collection, those are probably of less concern than the deep, bright, vivid color that emerald green creates.
I had a question. I needed to circle back. I apologize. I'm having some audio problems in the hotel, but this goes back to what you were talking about. You mentioned on multiple sections that you were talking about the ingestion of it is really the problem, and how to avoid it. Now, arsenic's been known since before the Renaissance, and the dangers of it have been well known long before it was being used in books. Is it the fact, did they just feel because you weren't eating it, it was totally fine? Why were they using this in all these applications when they knew the dangers of it?
That is a really great question. And that sort of cognitive dissonance has really baffled me. But I think that actually you're right, that there was just this feeling that, well, we're not eating it, so obviously it's going to be fine, right? But at the time, doctors were warning, hey, this, I tested this green ball gown and it was shedding all kinds of pigment that people could be breathing in. And so there was kind of a debate that was going on in the newspapers of the time, where you had some doctors, some consumer advocacy groups saying, we need to stop using this color in our domestic products. Like, this is terrible. People are going to accidentally get poisoned. And then you had sort of the business lobbies saying, look, this is a very lucrative color, and it's really going to harm the British economy if we can't sell this pigment. But people were buying it as a pigment, and they were also buying it as a rat poison and an agricultural insecticide. So they knew it was dangerous. They just somehow weren't quite making that connection that it could be really dangerous for themselves.
Well, arsenic was known also as the inheritance powder, right? So, I mean, and
I know your expertise is in the books, but you did mention the ball gowns. And that was something that I guess I had not made the connection. I knew about the arsenic and the gowns. So it wasn't an issue. I thought the issue with the gowns was that the arsenic was being absorbed into the skin. So that was not the case. It was actually being ingested.
I really don't know the answer to that, but I do know that in the accounts that I've found, where doctors have been warning against it, they commented on how easily the pigment shedded off of the gown. And there wasn't any mention of absorbing it through the skin, but that doesn't mean that wasn't also happening.
I mean, like you mentioned, they did use the arsenic as rat poison. And I believe it was in the Paris subway systems that they used some of that rat poison.
Yeah, and that's how it got the nickname Paris Green. Yeah, they were putting it down into the subterranean areas of Paris to try to control the rat poison. I see Brian has a great question about arsenic being used in cosmetics. And yeah, it absolutely was. It was popular for a time in face powder. There was a fashion for a while for women to have very pale skin. And if I'm understanding it correctly, what arsenic did is it destroyed the blood vessels at the surface of the skin. And so there were no blood vessels to make women look pink and rosy. And so they had that perfectly white complexion that was the fashion for a while.
That is scary.
It is really, it's scary for sure. I'd also like to mention that there are different forms of arsenic. And so like the pure element of arsenic all on its own is actually not poisonous, and you could eat it and it would pass through your system fine. It's really different compounds of arsenic that are the problem. And so, when you read these 19th century accounts of arsenic, sometimes they're talking about the white powder arsenic trisulfide. Sometimes they're talking about pigments like emerald green or Scheele's green. So it's just good to be aware that different accounts may be talking about different types of arsenic. And then there's also inorganic arsenic and organic arsenic. And organic arsenic is slightly less toxic because our body is able to metabolize it. But emerald green is an inorganic form of arsenic. So it's much more dangerous because it can build up in your body. Your body has no way of metabolizing it and getting rid of it. It's just going to keep building up in your system. And so that was part of our concern. with the Poison Book Project is thinking about book dealers and librarians and collectors who might have really repeated exposure over time to these bindings, and wondering if arsenic is building up in their system because of that.
And that brings us to a great question. Tim is asking, he's curious if there's been any response from the secondhand or rare book selling community from your project.
Yeah, I've heard from a number of book dealers and book collectors who have written to Winterthur Library requesting one of our emerald green bookmarks because they're concerned, and some book dealers who want to have it on hand in their shops so that as they get new inventory in, and as their customers are looking at books on the shelves, that everyone can kind of be double checking. Certainly, I think if you take precautions, it's fine to have these books in your collection or to be trading in them, dealing in them. It's just a matter of being aware that there is a risk inherent, and that, that there are safety precautions that you can and should take.
I think
Are there any regulations that you're aware of that would require, I mean, I'm assuming the answer is no, but would require some level of certification or information that if you are, quote unquote, dealing in deadly books, or you're, collecting, that you're effectively sending something, you could be sending something through the US Postal Service that would be considered a hazardous substance. So is there any regulations around that have gotten into the specificity of Paris green?
Not in the US. No, we don't have any safe exposure limits that have been defined for emerald green. So the industrial hygienist that we worked with from the University of Delaware said that because there are no safe exposure limits, his guidelines were for us to completely eliminate the possibility of exposure, if we can, by keeping the books sealed in bags. And really, trying to encourage our patrons to use digitized versions of books rather than the physical emerald green book, if they can. We're a material culture collection at Winterthur Library, and so the researchers who come to visit us like to see the stuff. They like to see the physical book. They don't want to use a digitized version of the book. And so, to protect the institution and protect our patrons, we're looking into, along with our legal counsel, like, how are we going to serve these materials to researchers who really want to see them in a safe way? So we're going to have to disclose this information. We may have to ask patrons to sign a waiver saying that they've been informed of the risks and that they've been given, protective equipment to help them handle the books safely. But as far as, legal liability, I'm not aware that there are any guidelines in the US governing the use of emerald green or products that have been colored with emerald green.
And I do believe in the UK, they haven't officially banned it. Have they?
No, they haven't either.
That's just bizarre to me. I mean, after all of the studies and everything that came out about the wallpaper in the Victorian times, you would think that they would officially ban this, but I guess they haven't.
No. I don't know if you're familiar with the Environmental Working Group here in the US, but I really like their approach to chemicals and consumer products, which is, rather than trying to get things banned, they're just trying to educate consumers better. Because as soon as you ban a chemical, it just gets replaced by another untested chemical, which can be used until it's proved to be harmful, right? And so the Environmental Working Group strategy is, well, instead of trying to get all these chemicals banned, why don't we just inform people, and then the consumer can make up their own mind, do I want to buy a plastic bottle with BPA in it or not? And so, it's when we started this project and we started publicly sharing the information that we were finding about emerald green, I was really worried in the beginning that people were going to start throwing away their green books. Like, I don't want to be known as the book conservator that, you know, caused a generation of readers to throw away their 19th century green books. But I think it's really just a matter of sharing that there is risk, but there is also that there are also safe ways to interact with these books and to handle them and store them.
And I think knowledge is such power, and there's no point in getting
Absolutely.
scared and throwing these books away. They can be preserved and cared for in the correct manner. And I really love the fact that your project is educating people on the correct way to handle these. And now in our community, when we see some of these books, we'll know how to handle them properly. And I just think that's fantastic. Now, Felicia had a comment, and I'm sorry I didn't get to it earlier. She was asking about celluloid family photo albums from the late 1800s. Does this just apply to those books from the 1860s and back?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. And I don't know what colorants were used to color celluloid. So I don't know if emerald green may have been used there. I do know that by the end of the 19th century, like aniline dyes were coming into use. They were a product of the coal tar industry. And so they were found to be very light fast, and they became very popular. And so a lot of the pigments that had been used earlier in the 19th century, like chrome yellow and emerald green, just fell out of favor because they were toxic, for one thing. And also they just weren't as stable as the new aniline dyes. So I sort of feel like by the end of the 19th century, there's much less concern about toxic elements in books.
One of the questions we've been talking a lot about the covers and the boards, and we're not really talking about anything that's inside. So I don't know really anything about 19th century publishing. Have you come across the research that you've done? Are there any books of note that were published at the time that edition was put out, that they were all done in Paris green, that are collectible in or noteworthy just because of the content or the author? Or are these just random books that most likely would not even be collected had they not had a Paris green cover?
That's a great question. We have definitely found these emerald green covers on a whole range of subject material. So books on canine pathology, books of poetry, novels, just like really a really broad range. So we haven't been able to correlate it with any specific subject matter. But some of the books that we found that are emerald green, the book covers were designed by famous artists or famous designers. And some of them are heavily illustrated and may be collected, for those examples of book illustrations. So the very first book that we identified with an emerald green cover, the title is Rustic Adornments for Homes of Taste by Shirley Hibbard. It was the second edition, which was published in 1857. And the book cover was designed by John Layton, who was a very famous book cover designer in England from the 19th century. And the illustrations inside were wood engravings from the workshop of Benjamin Fawcett, who was probably the most well-known and prolific wood engraver in England in the 19th century. And those illustrations are printed with a color wood engrave process. But then Benjamin Fawcett's workshop, he had a whole bunch of young girls who worked for him as color correctors. And so they would use hand watercolors to go back and correct the plates. So they're really beautiful illustrations. And I could definitely see these books having appeal to a collector for the illustrations. And we also tested the pigments and colorants that were used on the illustrations inside the book, and we also found arsenic there.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, double threat, arsenic inside and outside.
And I know you are not a collector. You are from the conservation side, but I'd be curious. You mentioned that the Paris green cover was actually the second edition. And, again,
Yeah.
not being particularly knowledgeable in book collecting, first editions usually are the go-to. The value of that, I'm assuming the first edition were also hand-tipped art, but it wouldn't have had the Paris green cover. Which becomes more valuable? The first edition that doesn't have Paris green, or the second edition that will kill you?
It's a really good question. And I guess it just sort of depends on if there's a market out there. Are collectors interested in collecting poison books? That could drive the value up. But also, it's only the second edition that had the cover designed by John Layton. So for someone who collects, signed monogrammed, it has the JL monogram embedded in the design. So, for a collector who's interested in collecting signed book covers, they might go for the second edition rather than the
But
first
not
edition.
all of John Layton's designs were done in Paris in the emerald green.
No,
for other books.
no,
So
not at all.
it's not something he was known for. It was just that particular book happened to get done with. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And I've actually found several copies of that book at different institutions that were bound in emerald green. But I've also found copies of that book, that second edition, that were bound in a maroon cloth, which does not contain arsenic. So it was like a strange time in the bookbinding industry. So books were sort of semi-mass produced. They were still being bound by hand, but sort of in this assembly line style by big binderies.
Now, have they found earlier texts inside of old Victorian book bindings?
We haven't found any like that yet, but that would be really, really interesting. An older book that was rebound. Typically when like a Victorian era collector would have a book rebound, they were usually going to have it done in leather, sort of like a higher end material. The books that were bound in cloth tended to be retail products that were bound to be sold as a ready-made book.
And those were more readily available to the public then?
Yeah, and a more affordable price point for the public than books bound in leather or parchment.
Great. Now, I wanted to wrap up the show with the book that I have, because a lot of people I know are now probably thinking green books in general. But you mentioned that this green book is a little bit different than, and if you match it to the swatches here, maybe not showing up on camera as well, but this is a slightly different green. So I know it's hard to tell through the screen, but what kind of green do you suspect this to be versus the Paris or emerald green?
So seeing this book, there are lighter, brighter patches of green, but I think that is coming from the cloth having blanched from exposure to water or very high humidity. And I think that the original color is this darker forest green that you see in some areas. And if that's the case, then I would strongly suspect that this is chrome green. And chrome green is a colorant that was made by blending chrome yellow, which is a lead and chromium based pigment, with Prussian blue. And so that chrome yellow contains both chromium and lead, both of which are toxic elements that you don't want to ingest. And I should also mention that no matter what color book you have from the 19th century, we tested books in a whole rainbow array of colors, and 40% of them contained high levels of lead. Wow. So any book from the 19th century that is bound in cloth, please just, pay attention when you're using it. Maybe don't touch your face while you're handling it. Don't eat or drink while you're handling it, and wash your hands when you're done handling it, just to be extra cautious.
And probably keep that away from Louis. Louis likes to chew things.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Keep it away from Louis.
Now, for the lay people, is there a way, is this something that a university, and I would say for someone that maybe has a collection or a variety that legitimately feel these could be books of concern, are there resources available either for free or for a charge that you can get books, either the X-ray fluorescence or any of the services? Is that something that would be available?
I think it's a great idea to reach out to local institutions. Often museums and libraries that have this sort of equipment will perform, analysis for the public, either for a fee or, in our case, we have been scanning suspicious books for neighboring institutions when we're able to do that. And we've been doing that without a charge for our peer institutions because they're letting us keep the data and share that as part of our project. But I also know some collectors who have been successful reaching out to museums, like a collector I know in New Jersey reached out to the Metropolitan Museum of Art Conservation Lab, and they did analysis on 2 books in his collection and did confirm that one of them contained arsenic. So it's worth just calling around and reaching out. And even if the institutions near you aren't willing to perform the analysis for you, they may be able to connect you with someone in the area who does this kind of work on a consultation fee basis.
Now, something that you said in this discussion made me think of this, and I know there's different philosophies through museums, and there's the idea of conservation versus restoration versus all the different versions. If particularly your colleague that was talking about the painting, or maybe even in your case with the books, do you ever try and restore the covers? Like, say the cover has deteriorated or torn. If you were to try to repair that, would you try and do that with the arsenic material? Or do you not actually get involved in something like that?
That's a great question. So that very first book that sort of kicked off the whole Poison Book project is still sitting in a box in my lab with the covers off. I was, supposed to repair that binding so that it could go on exhibit. But as soon as we figured out how much arsenic it contained, we put a halt. We pulled it from the exhibit. We put a halt on it. And honestly, I'm still not comfortable treating it. And so we're thinking we're probably just going to keep it bagged and boxed for the time being. In my conversations with our industrial hygienist, it just sounds like doing, what we call an interventive treatment, doing an active book repair that involves adhesives is just not a great idea with these books, which is also like a caution. If you have an emerald green book, you also don't want to be like repurposing that in some way and using glues on it, because the moisture in the adhesive can actually cause the arsenic to migrate and collect. And so you can get areas with pockets that are heavier in arsenic than others, which just makes it much more unpredictably dangerous.
Excellent. Thank you. Uh-oh, did we lose
My mic, I was muted apparently. I didn't know it because Lily started to bark. I just think it's wonderful that you're doing this work to help educate people. And that first book you found is just fascinating. I had no idea that these existed. And I'm just so glad that we now have the tools to be able to kind of help identify these and be a little bit more cautious when we're collecting and selling some of these older books. Now, this bookmark is something that you can pick up through your website. Is that right?
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. So you can email reference@winterthur.org and put Emerald Green bookmark in the subject line of the email. And if you include your mailing address, then we will mail you one of these bookmarks free of charge. We're mailing them out just as an outreach tool to try to help people and educate them. So we're happy to make those freely available.
And Catherine says she just sent an email about getting bookmark, which is wonderful. I think Catherine suspects that she may have some books that potentially could be dangerous. So I'm really glad, Catherine, that you're reaching out. So thank you so much, Melissa, for giving us these tools tonight and talking about some of the history. This was so interesting, and it just has been a great chat.
Absolutely. This was really fun for me too. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk to a new audience about this. We're so happy to get the word out there. So thanks for helping us do that.
Oh, absolutely. So where can we find you next, or what projects are you working on?
We are continuing work on the Poison Book Project. I'll be, Omicron variant permitting, I will be traveling to London in January to do some archival research on book cloth manufacture and on the binderies that we're using emerald green book cloth. And we're continuing to scan our collections, looking for other elements, other pigments that could be toxic, and just trying to get a handle on those and create guidelines for those as well. So keep an eye on the website for more updates.
Fantastic. And I've linked that website down below, folks. So if you're not familiar with that, definitely go click on it and have a look. Really some interesting things and a great way to stay updated on the project. Patrick, thanks so much for joining us tonight. What's next on your channel?
Well, as you can see from my beautiful background, I am traveling again. So I'm in hotels this week. So I will not be doing my weekly sale tomorrow night. So the next thing I've got on my channel is on Sunday. The triptych will return. So Tales from the Triptych will be Sunday on my channel, Trusty Huckster Mercantile, 8 p.m. Eastern, where I will be telling the tales of the 12 days of Christmas. It is the last triptych before Christmas. So we will celebrate, talk a little bit about the history, where it all came from, and of course, talk a little bit about collecting it and what to be on the lookout for in celebrating and collecting vintage 12 Days of Christmas.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Patrick. And I'm looking forward to being a part of that. So Tales from the Triptych on Patrick's channel at 8 p.m. Eastern on Sunday. So stay tuned for that for more fun research. And our next duo dive will be returning next Wednesday. So stay tuned for that as well. Patrick, is that on your channel?
I have no idea. I was really hoping you were going to ask because I don't know what we're doing.
So, well, folks, that is where
we'll just edit that part out.
Yeah, stay tuned to Instagram so that you will know our next announcement for the duo dive. So stay tuned for that and for all of the fun things coming up. Melissa, again, thank you so much for joining us and for all of the wonderful comments and questions in the chat. We could not do the show without all of our commenters. So thank you so much. And as always, folks, I hope that you will stay in, stay safe, and binge YouTube. Bye-bye now.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.